walked away. "Merry Christmas," she called after him. Chapter 1. It hurt to hear, and he closed his eyes briefly once he was out of sight. Whatever hope he'd had for having his own mate had crumbled slowly over the last few weeks. He didn't blame her. None of this was her fault. But he didn't want to hear that she wished him well. Not yet. Maybe someday he'd be able to hear her and not think of all the things she'd shouted at him over the last few months. He needed to talk to the captain and let him know that he'd released her from their bond, or, more accurately, that he'd accepted her declaration of hatred for him. It felt like a failure. Sure, if the human entertainment he'd watched was correct, everything had been against them. But there had been worse odds of a connection in the history of both of their species, and couples had managed to overcome them. Chegar knew he was the problem. There was something wrong, something missing in him, that kept him from being able to convince the woman he'd recognized to bond with him. The situation wasn't ideal, but if he'd been the Orvax he should have been, he'd have found a way to overcome all their barriers. He only had to look at the successful couples around him to know this. It wasn't the first time he'd wondered if he'd lost more than a couple limbs in the accident that nearly killed him. The Orvax had outlawed the kinds of modifications that had been done on his body, and he wondered if there was a reason nobody had told him about. Maybe they didn't know? As a species, the Orvax had been losing the ability to recognize their mates. It was mostly downplayed as old-fashioned and unnecessary, but the sharp drop-off on the number of offspring suggested that maybe it wasn't as unnecessary as they'd been told. It did leave the question of where the ability came from and how much it contributed to other problems that had been growing. It wasn't something Chegar had thought of much before. In fact, he'd always assumed he'd never match with someone with recognition and had written it off as an option. He didn't realize how much of that assumption had driven his desire to leave the planet. Until he'd touched Jamie. One brief blinding moment had put everything into perspective. The careful avoidance of anything to do with recognition or finding a mate was revealed for what it was, a desire to shield himself from the pain and heartbreak of broken hopes. There had been no match for him listed in the database on the planet, something he'd been told was rare, so what small hope he'd had of starting a family, even by chance, had been negated before it had the chance to manifest. Pursuing recognition in the face of that seemed like the surest way to get his heart broken. Instead, he'd thrown himself into his work. There was very little he loved more than being behind the controls of a new ship, pushing it to its limits and making it back in one piece. Until he'd made it back in more than one piece. He'd never asked what landed him in Mintanar's care rather than someone else, but he'd been alternately cursing him and thanking him since. Any other doctor would likely have let him die of his injuries. Mintanar, though, saw an opportunity to make him better. Chegar could still remember the gleam in the doctor's eye as they talked about what he loved about his job, his mission. When he could finally start piecing together moments into full conversations and memories, he'd realized they were still on a ship in orbit around the planet. Not a close orbit either, but one that was usually used to launch deep space explorations. He hadn't woken up in the medical bay of the ship either, but in the hangar that had what was left of the shuttle he'd been piloting when it broke apart. They'd never made it to medical, he'd been told. Mintanar had met the shuttle at the hangar with a mobile repair bed in the hopes of getting him stable enough to save. Something had gone wrong, maybe? Something about his bio-nanos not letting go of his system and integrating themselves into the parts of the shuttle they'd been sprayed across. He still wasn't certain how the whole thing worked, or why. There was a nagging doubt in the back of his mind that Mintanar didn't...